The text message came at 2:47 a.m., the glow of my phone cutting through the darkness like a blade. Stay away from her or you'll regret it. No name, but I knew exactly who sent it. The same man who'd been calling my wife during family dinners, the same voice I'd heard laughing in the background when she claimed to be working late. For 3 months I'd been living with suspicions that gnawed at my gut like acid. Tonight those suspicions had teeth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Michael Chen, and 6 months ago I thought I had it all figured out. 38 years old, senior architect at Davidson Associates in downtown Seattle, married to the most beautiful woman I'd ever laid eyes on. Our house in Bellevue overlooked Lake Washington, and every morning I'd wake up thinking I was the luckiest man alive. Rebecca worked as a marketing director for a tech startup, all sharp suits and sharper smiles that could close deals before lunch. We'd been married for 8 years, together for 10, and I genuinely believed we were building something that would last forever. The first crack in my perfect world appeared on a Thursday in March. Rebecca came home from what she called a client dinner, her lipstick perfectly intact but her story falling apart under the simplest questions. Which restaurant? Who was there? What did you discuss? Every answer came a beat too slow, her eyes darting to the left the way they always did when she was improvising. I'd learned to read those tells during a decade of loving her, but I'd never had reason to use them as evidence before. The second crack came a week later when her phone buzzed during our anniversary dinner. She glanced at the screen, and for just a moment her face lit up with a smile I hadn't seen in months, the kind of smile that used to be reserved for me. She declined the call without explaining who it was, but the damage was done. That smile haunted me for days, replaying in my mind like a broken record. By April, the cracks had become chasms. Rebecca started working later, traveling more frequently, and when she was home she felt like a stranger wearing my wife's face. We'd sit across from each other at dinner, making conversation that felt rehearsed, artificial. She'd ask about my projects at the firm, I'd ask about her campaigns, and neither of us would really listen to the answers. The silence between words grew longer, heavier, until it felt like we were drowning in everything we weren't saying. The breaking point came on a rainy Wednesday evening in late April. I'd gotten home early, hoping to surprise her with dinner reservations at the place where we'd had our first date. Instead, I found her in our bedroom, pacing back and forth while talking on the phone in a voice I'd never heard before. Soft, intimate, vulnerable in ways she hadn't been with me in years. I know it's complicated, she was saying, her back to the door, but I can't stop thinking about last night. About us. There was a pause, then a laugh that made my stomach turn. He doesn't suspect anything, we're safe. I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. The dinner reservations slipped from my fingers, fluttering to the floor like dead leaves. This was it, the moment every married man dreads, when suspicion crystallizes into certainty. My wife was having an affair, and she was talking about me like I was an obstacle to be avoided rather than a husband to be respected. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling while Rebecca slept beside me, her phone face down on the nightstand like it was guarding secrets. I wanted to grab it, to scroll through her messages and find proof of what I already knew. But some part of me, the part that still believed in the woman I'd married, held me back. Maybe I'd misunderstood. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe I was losing my mind. The uncertainty was eating me alive. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't eat. Couldn't think about anything except the growing distance between us. My partner at the firm, James Rodriguez, pulled me aside after I'd botched a client presentation that should have been routine. "Mike, what's going on with you?" he asked, his voice heavy with concern. "You've been somewhere else for weeks." I wanted to tell him everything, to pour out the whole mess and ask for advice. Instead, I shook my head and mumbled something about stress at home. James wasn't buying it, but he let it slide. That was the kind of friend he was, always there when you needed him but smart enough to know when to give you space. The decision to hire a private investigator came during a sleepless night in early May. I'd been staring at Rebecca's phone for hours, watching it light up with messages she'd check and quickly delete. The idea had been brewing in the back of my mind for weeks, but I'd been too proud, too scared, too hopeful to act on it. Finally, desperation won out over dignity. I found Thomas Kane through a referral from a lawyer friend who specialized in divorce cases. Kane's office was in a nondescript building in Pioneer Square, the kind of place that looked legitimate enough to trust but anonymous enough to disappear into. When I met him, I was surprised by how normal he seemed. Mid-50s, graying hair, the kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting him, perfect for his line of work. "Mr. Chen," he said, settling behind his desk with a coffee-stained notepad. Tell me what's going on. So I did. I told him about the late nights, the mysterious phone calls, the growing distance between Rebecca and me. I told him about the smile that wasn't meant for me, and the conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Kane listened without judgment, taking notes in shorthand that looked like hieroglyphics. How long has this been going on? He asked when I finished. 3 months that I'm sure of, maybe longer. He nodded as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. Infidelity cases follow patterns, Mr. Chen. If your wife is having an affair, the evidence will surface. It always does. The question is whether you're prepared for what we might find. I thought about that question for a long moment. Was I prepared? Could anyone ever truly be prepared to have their worst fears confirmed? Finally, I nodded. I need to know the truth. Kane's retainer was $5,000 with additional fees for surveillance and documentation. It felt like I was paying to destroy my own life, but the alternative was continuing to live in limbo, watching my mate. We shook hands and he promised to start immediately. One thing, Mr. Chen, he said as I reached the door, once we start this process there's no going back. Whatever we find, you'll have to live with it. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want? I met his eyes, feeling something cold and hard settle in my chest. I'm certain. The waiting was agony. Kane told me it could take days or weeks to gather solid evidence depending on how careful Rebecca was being. In the meantime, I had to go home every night and pretend nothing had changed. I had to sit across from her at dinner, make small talk about our days, and sleep beside her knowing that she might be dreaming of another man. Rebecca seemed oblivious to my internal turmoil, or maybe she was just too distracted by her own secrets to notice. She continued her pattern of late nights and weekend trips, always with plausible explanations that felt just hollow enough to be lies. I started paying attention to details I'd previously ignored: the way she'd check her phone constantly, the new perfume she'd started wearing, the subtle changes in her appearance that suggested she was dressing for someone else. 2 weeks into Kane's investigation, Rebecca announced she had to attend a marketing conference in Portland over the weekend. She'd be leaving Friday afternoon and returning Sunday evening. As she packed her bag Thursday night, chatting about the presentations she was excited to see, I felt like I was watching a performance. Every gesture seemed calculated, every word chosen for maximum believability. "I'll miss you," she said, kissing me goodbye Friday morning. The words felt hollow, practiced, like lines from a script she'd memorized. "Miss you too," I replied, and wondered if either of us meant it anymore. That Friday evening, alone in our too-quiet house, I got the call from Kane that changed everything. "Mr. Chen, we need to meet. Tonight if possible." His voice carried a weight that made my stomach drop. "You found something?" "Yes, and you're not going to like it." We met at a 24-hour diner near the waterfront, the kind of place where conversations could disappear into the ambient noise of late-night Seattle. Kane slid a manila envelope across the table, thick with photographs and documents that represented the death of my marriage. "Your wife checked into the Fairmont Olympic Hotel this afternoon," he said without preamble. "Room 1247. She wasn't alone." My hands shook as I opened the envelope. The first photograph showed Rebecca getting out of her BMW in the hotel's valet area, looking radiant in a way that made my chest ache. The second showed her waiting in the lobby, checking her watch with the nervous energy of someone anticipating something wonderful. The third photograph introduced me to David Thornton. He was everything I wasn't: tall where I was average height, athletic where I spent too much time behind a desk, confident in a way that seemed to radiate from his core, dark hair, sharp jawline, the kind of smile that probably made investors write checks without reading the fine print. He approached Rebecca from across the lobby, and even in a still photograph I could see the electricity between them. "David Thornton," Kane said, consulting his notes, 35 years old, venture capitalist with Morrison Associates, divorced, no kids, lives in a penthouse in Belltown. He's been funding your wife's startup for the past 6 months. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. The client dinners, the weekend trips, the mysterious phone calls.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Rebecca hadn't just been cheating on me, she'd been building a relationship with a man who held her professional future in his hands. Business and pleasure tangled together in a way that made me feel naive for ever trusting her. The photographs told the story in painful detail. Rebecca and David checking in together, his hand on the small of her back as they walked toward the elevators. Rebecca laughing at something he whispered in her ear. David's fingers intertwined with hers as they waited for their floor. Each image was a knife in my chest, but I couldn't stop looking. There's more, Kane said quietly, pulling out a different set of photos from last weekend when she said she was visiting her sister in Vancouver. These were worse. Rebecca and David at a wine bar in the Pearl District, leaning across a small table like lovers sharing secrets. Rebecca feeding him a bite of dessert, her eyes bright with an intimacy I hadn't seen in months. David's hand covering hers on the table, protective and possessive in a way that made something ugly coil in my stomach. How long? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Based on what we've documented, at least 4 months. But the financial relationship goes back further. He started investing in her company 8 months ago. 8 months, 2 months before I'd started noticing the changes in her behavior. She'd been planning this, building toward it, laying the groundwork for a life that didn't include me. The betrayal felt complete, systematic, like she'd been executing a business plan for the dissolution of our marriage. Kane reached into the envelope one more time, pulling out a stack of printed emails. We managed to access some communications between them. I should warn you, Mr. Chen, these are explicit. I took the papers with numb fingers, scanning the subject lines that read like love letters written in corporate speak. Rest, weekend proposal. Following up on our private meeting, thoughts on our future partnership. The language was coded but unmistakable. They weren't just having an affair, they were planning a future together. One email sent from David's personal account just 3 days earlier made my blood run cold. Rebecca, I've been thinking about our conversation regarding your current situation. I understand the complexities, but I believe it's time to move forward with the next phase of our partnership. Both personally and professionally, I've looked into some properties that might interest you. Places where we could start fresh without the complications of your previous commitments. Think about what we discussed. You deserve to be happy, and I want to be the one to make that happen. We can announce the new funding round after you've handled things at home. Love, D. The message was clear. David was asking Rebecca to leave me, offering her both a new relationship and financial security in one package. The previous commitments he referenced so casually represented 8 years of my life, 8 years of building something I thought was permanent. There's one more thing, Kane said, his expression grim. This morning while your wife was checking in with Thornton, we intercepted this text message sent from his phone to an unknown number. He showed me his own phone screen displaying a message that made my hands clench into fists. Took care of the husband problem. Sent him a message to back off. Rebecca is mine now. The timestamp showed 2:47 a.m., exactly when I'd received the threatening text that had woken me up. David Thornton hadn't just stolen my wife, he'd threatened me directly, treating me like an obstacle to be managed rather than a human being whose life he'd destroyed. I stared at the evidence spread across the diner table, feeling something fundamental shift inside me. The heartbreak was still there, raw and consuming, but it was being joined by something colder and more dangerous. Rage, yes, but also a calculating fury that surprised me with its intensity. What do you want to do with this information, Mr. Chen? Kane asked. I gathered the photographs carefully, sliding them back into the envelope along with the emails and phone records. 8 years of marriage reduced to documentation. 8 years of love and trust and shared dreams revealed as an elaborate lie. I want to show Mr. Thornton exactly what kind of game he's been playing, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me, and I want to make sure he understands the consequences of threatening the wrong man. Kane nodded slowly. Be careful, Mr. Chen. Men like Thornton don't like being cornered. They have resources, connections. Make sure you're prepared for whatever comes next. I thought about David's arrogant message, his casual dismissal of me as a husband problem to be solved. He clearly thought he was dealing with some naive architect who would quietly step aside when threatened. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Let him bring his resources, I said, standing up from the table. I've got something better. What's that? The truth. That night, I sat in my home office surrounded by the evidence of my wife's betrayal, planning my next move. David Thornton thought he could intimidate me with a threatening text, thought he could steal my wife and erase me from the equation without consequences. He'd made one critical mistake. He'd underestimated exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. I opened my laptop and began researching everything I could find about David Thornton. His venture capital firm, his investment history, his social media presence, his professional relationships. If he wanted to play games, I'd make sure I understood the rules better than he did. By morning I had a plan, and David Thornton was about to discover that some men don't disappear quietly when threatened. Some men fight back. The question was no longer whether Rebecca was having an affair, the question was what I was going to do about it, and how far I was willing to go to make both of them understand that actions have consequences. As the sun rose over Lake Washington, painting our bedroom in shades of gold and amber, I made a decision that would change all of our lives forever. The war was just beginning. Monday morning arrived with the kind of gray Seattle drizzle that matched my mood perfectly. Rebecca had returned from her fake conference the night before, full of stories about presentations and networking events that I now knew were complete fabrications. She'd kissed me hello with lips that had been on another man just hours earlier, and I'd smiled back like nothing had changed while Kane's photographs burned in my mind like acid. I waited until she left for work before making my first move. David Thornton's office was in the Columbia Center, the tallest building in Seattle, because of course a man like him would need to literally look down on the rest of the city. His venture capital firm occupied the entire 42nd floor, all glass walls and modern furniture that screamed success and intimidation in equal measure. The receptionist was young and polished, the kind of woman who'd been hired as much for her appearance as her efficiency. She looked up from her computer with a practiced smile that faltered slightly when she saw the manila envelope in my hands. "I'm here to see David Thornton," I said, keeping my voice level and professional. I don't have an appointment, but I think he'll want to see what I've brought him." "Thornton is in meetings all morning," she replied, the smile becoming more strained. "If you'd like to schedule something for later this week, tell him Michael Chen is here," I interrupted gently. "Tell him I have some photographs he'll find very interesting. I think you'll discover his schedule has just opened up." She hesitated, clearly unsure how to handle a walk-in visitor who seemed too calm to be dismissed but too insistent to be ignored. Finally she picked up her phone and spoke in hushed tones to someone on the other end. After a moment, she hung up and looked at me with poorly concealed curiosity. "Mr. Thornton will see you now, please follow me." The walk to his corner office felt like a march to the gallows, but I wasn't sure who was being executed. David's office was everything I'd expected, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of Elliott Bay, expensive art on the walls, a desk that probably cost more than most people's cars. The man himself stood behind that desk, and seeing him in person confirmed everything the photographs had suggested. He was exactly the kind of man women like Rebecca fell for, tall, confident, wearing a suit that fit like it had been tailored specifically for his body. His handshake was firm, his smile warm and disarming, and for just a moment I understood why my wife had been willing to risk everything for him. "Mr. Chen," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk, "please sit down. I have to admit, I'm curious about these photographs you mentioned." I remained standing, placing the envelope on his pristine desk between us like evidence at a trial. "I think you know exactly what these are, David. May I call you David?" His smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Of course. And what exactly do you think you have there?" Instead of answering, I opened the envelope and began laying out photographs one by one. David and Rebecca checking into the Fairmont Olympic. David and Rebecca at dinner in Portland. David's hand on my wife's back as they walked through the hotel lobby. With each image, his practiced composure cracked a little more. "These are very good quality," I said conversationally, "professional-grade equipment, excellent lighting. My private investigator really knows his craft." David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Mr. Chen." "I'm not implying anything," I replied, placing the final photograph on his desk. It was the most damning one, Rebecca and David kissing outside the hotel, her wedding ring clearly visible on the hand she'd placed against his chest. "I'm stating facts. You've been having an affair with my wife for at least 4 months. You've been funding her startup as part of your seduction strategy. And you sent me a threatening text message telling me to stay away from her." The mask finally slipped completely. David's charming smile disappeared, replaced by the cold calculation of a man who'd been caught but wasn't ready to surrender. He leaned back in his chair studying me with new interest. "Threatening text message," he said. "I think you're mistaken, I've never sent you any messages." I pulled out my phone and showed him the screenshot. 2:47 a.m. Saturday morning. "Stay away from her, or you'll regret it. My investigator traced it back to your number." David glanced at the screen then shrugged with infuriating casualness. Anyone can spoof a phone number these days. You can't prove I sent that. You're right, I agreed, gathering the photographs back into a neat stack. I can't prove you sent that specific message, but I can prove everything else. The hotel receipts, the restaurant charges, the private meetings disguised as business dinners. I can prove that you've been systematically seducing my wife while lying to both of us about your intentions. He stood up abruptly, moving to the window with his hands clasped behind his back. For a long moment he stared out at the city below, and I could almost see him calculating his options. "What do you want?" he asked finally, not turning around. "I want you to understand something," I said, moving to stand beside him at the window. "You think you're dealing with some suburban architect who's going to quietly disappear when threatened. You think Rebecca is just another conquest, another successful woman you can manipulate with money and power. You're wrong on both counts." Now he did turn to face me, and for the first time I saw genuine wariness in his expression. "Is that a threat, Mr. Chen?" "It's a clarification," I replied calmly. "You see, David, you made a mistake when you sent me that text. You revealed something about yourself. You're not just a man having an affair, you're a man who thinks he can intimidate people into submission. That tells me you've done this before. It tells me there are probably other wives, other husbands, other families you've destroyed without giving it a second thought." His silence confirmed my suspicion. David Thornton wasn't just sleeping with my wife, he was a predator who used his position and wealth to take whatever he wanted. "So here's what's going to happen," I continued, my voice never rising above conversational level. "You're going to end your relationship with Rebecca. You're going to withdraw your funding from her startup, and you're going to do it all without telling her about this conversation." David laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. "And why would I do any of that? You've got some photographs of 2 consenting adults. Rebecca chose to be with me, Mr. Chen. She chose me over you. Those pictures don't change that fact." I nodded, as if this was exactly the response I'd expected. "You're absolutely right, Rebecca did make a choice, but here's what you don't understand, so did I." I reached into my jacket and pulled out a second envelope, much thicker than the first. David's eyes tracked the movement with the wariness of a man who'd just realized he'd underestimated his opponent. "While you were busy seducing my wife, I was busy learning about you," I said, placing the new envelope on his desk. "It's amazing what a good investigator can find when they really put their mind to it. Financial records, business dealings, personal relationships. You'd be surprised how many of your former partners were willing to talk once they understood what kind of man you really are." David's face had gone pale. "What are you talking about?" I opened the second envelope, and began laying out documents the way a prosecutor might present evidence to a jury. Bank statements showing suspicious transfers between David's personal accounts and various shell companies. Email exchanges discussing stock manipulation schemes. Photographs of David with other married women at various hotels and restaurants. Jennifer Walsh, married to a Boeing executive. You had an affair with her last year while funding her consulting firm. When her husband found out, he tried to confront you. The next week, Boeing mysteriously lost a major contract that Jennifer's firm had been competing for. Coincidence? David's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You can't prove any connection between those events." "Maybe not in court," I agreed, "but I don't need to prove it in court, I just need to prove it to the right people. Like Jennifer's husband, who happens to sit on the board of 3 major companies that do business with your firm. Or Sarah Martinez, whose husband is a federal prosecutor. Or Catherine Kim, whose father owns the largest construction company in the Pacific Northwest." With each name, David's composure cracked a little more. These weren't just random affairs, they were part of a pattern of predatory behavior that had been flying under the radar for years. "You see, David, you've been very careful to avoid legal consequences for your actions. But you haven't been careful enough to avoid the consequences of reputation. Men like you live and die by the opinions of other powerful men. And when those men learn that you've been systematically targeting their wives, their daughters, their business partners, well, let's just say your access to their money and influence tends to dry up very quickly." I pulled out one final document and placed it on top of the pile. It was a draft press release, professionally formatted and ready for distribution. "Local venture capitalist under investigation for pattern of sexual misconduct," I read aloud. "Multiple sources confirm that David Thornton of Morrison & Associates has been using his position to coerce sexual relationships with female entrepreneurs seeking funding. It goes on to detail your relationships with at least 6 different women over the past 3 years, all of whom were financially dependent on your firm in some way. David lunged forward and grabbed the document, his hands shaking as he read it. This is defamation. I'll sue you for everything you're worth. With what money? I asked pleasantly. By the time this story breaks, you'll be too busy trying to save your career to worry about lawsuits. Your investors will run for the hills, your clients will demand their money back. Your partners will distance themselves so fast it'll make your head spin. You'll be lucky to get a job selling insurance in Spokane, much less continue as a venture capitalist in Seattle. The silence stretched between us like a wire about to snap. David stood there clutching the press release, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. Finally he looked up at me with something that might have been respect. "What do you want?" he asked again, but this time his voice carried none of its earlier arrogance. "I already told you. End it with Rebecca. Withdraw the funding, walk away, do it quietly, do it cleanly, and maybe this press release never sees the light of day." David set the document down carefully, as if it might explode. "And if I don't," I smiled for the first time since entering his office, "then you'll discover just how quickly a man's life can be destroyed when he threatens the wrong person." I began gathering the documents back into their envelopes, taking my time to let the weight of the moment settle over both of us. David watched in silence, and I could see him running calculations, weighing options, trying to find an angle that would let him keep both his career and my wife. "There's one more thing you should know," I said, as I sealed the second envelope. "Rebecca doesn't know about any of this. As far as she's concerned, you're going to have a sudden change of heart, business pressures maybe, a desire to focus on your career instead of personal entanglements. Whatever story you want to tell her is fine with me, as long as the end result is the same." "And what if she doesn't accept it?" David asked. "What if she fights for our relationship?" "Then you'll have to convince her otherwise," I replied. "I'm sure a man of your talents can find a way to let her down gently. After all, you've had plenty of practice." The barb hit home. David's face flushed red, but he kept his mouth shut. He was finally beginning to understand that this wasn't a negotiation, it was a surrender. I moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. "Oh, and David, if you ever contact my wife again, if you ever send me another threatening message, if you ever even think about interfering in my life, this conversation will seem like a friendly chat compared to what happens next."
Do we understand each other? He nodded stiffly, the fight completely gone out of him. David Thornton, the man who thought he could steal other men's wives and intimidate their husbands into submission, had been reduced to a scared boy who'd finally met someone scarier than himself. I left him standing in his corner office, surrounded by the symbols of success that were about to become meaningless if he made the wrong choice. The receptionist looked up as I passed her desk, and I gave her the same polite smile I'd worn when I arrived. "Please tell Mr. Thornton that if he needs to reach me he has my number," I said pleasantly. "But I suspect our business is concluded." The elevator ride down felt like descending from a mountain peak. 42 floors of space between me and the man who'd tried to destroy my marriage. As the city spread out below me through the glass walls, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: control. For the first time since discovering Rebecca's affair, I wasn't reacting to someone else's choices. I was making them. My phone buzzed as I reached the lobby. A text from Rebecca: "Working late again tonight. Don't wait up. Love you." I stared at the message for a long moment, wondering if she was actually working, or if she was planning another rendezvous with David. It didn't matter anymore. Either way, her lies were about to catch up with her. I typed back, "Love you too, see you at home," because I would see her at home, and very soon she was going to discover that the comfortable lies she'd been living were no longer an option. The confrontation with David had been the easy part. He was a stranger, a predator who'd inserted himself into my life for his own selfish purposes. Dealing with him had been a matter of strategy and leverage, but Rebecca was different. Rebecca was the woman I'd loved for 10 years, the woman I'd married, the woman who'd shared my bed and my dreams and my future. Confronting her wouldn't just be about strategy. It would be about the fundamental question of whether our marriage could survive the truth. As I drove home through the Seattle traffic, I found myself thinking about the last time we'd been truly happy together. It had been maybe 6 months ago, a lazy Sunday morning when we'd stayed in bed late, talking about our plans for the future. Rebecca had mentioned wanting to travel more, maybe take a sabbatical from work to explore Europe.
I'd talked about the possibility of starting our own architectural firm, something small and personal that would let me focus on residential projects instead of corporate towers. We'd felt like a team that morning, like partners building something beautiful together. Now I realized that even then, she'd probably already met David. Even as she was talking about our future, she was probably already planning her exit from it. The house felt different when I walked through the front door, same furniture, same photographs on the walls, same coffee mug Rebecca had left in the sink that morning. But underneath the familiar surface, everything had changed. This wasn't our home anymore, it was a crime scene. The scene of 8 years of marriage being systematically dismantled by lies and betrayal. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, and sat in my office, staring at the manila envelopes that contained the evidence of my wife's infidelity. Kane had done thorough work, every photograph was clear, every document was authentic, every piece of evidence was irrefutable. But looking at them now, I realized that proof wasn't enough. I needed Rebecca to understand not just what she'd done, but why it mattered. I needed her to see the wreckage she'd created and take responsibility for it. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, and still Rebecca didn't come home. Her text had said she was working late, but I knew better. She was probably with David right now, celebrating the success of their latest deception. They had no idea that their carefully constructed lies were about to come crashing down around them. My phone rang at 12:47 a.m. Rebecca's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But curiosity won out. "Hello, Michael?" Her voice sounded strange, strained. "I'm still at the office, I know it's late, but this project is really important, and I need to get it finished tonight." I closed my eyes, marveling at how easily the lies came to her. "Of course, don't worry about it. Get your work done." "You're not angry?" "Why would I be angry?" I asked, injecting just enough confusion into my voice to sound genuine. "You're working hard to build your career, I support that." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. Finally she spoke again, and her voice carried a note I couldn't quite identify. "Guilt, maybe. Or fear. I love you, Michael. You know that, right?" "I love you too," I replied, and realized with a shock that it was still true. Despite everything she'd done, despite the lies and the betrayal, and the systematic destruction of our marriage, some part of me still loved the woman she used to be. The woman she might have been if she'd chosen differently. "I'll be home soon," she said. "Maybe we can do something special this weekend." "Just the two of us, I'd like that," I said, and meant it. Because this weekend we were definitely going to do something special. We were going to have the most honest conversation of our marriage. After she hung up, I sat in the darkness of my office, thinking about the woman I'd married, and the stranger she'd become. Rebecca had always been ambitious, always been driven, but she'd also been kind. Thoughtful. The kind of person who remembered birthdays and brought soup to sick friends and cried during sad movies. When had that woman disappeared? When had she been replaced by someone who could lie so effortlessly, who could build an entire secret life, while pretending to love me? Maybe the woman I'd fallen in love with had never really existed. Maybe I'd been in love with an illusion, a carefully constructed persona that Rebecca had maintained just long enough to secure the life she wanted. The thought was almost more painful than the affair itself. At least adultery was a choice, a mistake that could theoretically be forgiven. But if our entire relationship had been built on false pretenses, if the woman I'd loved was nothing more than an elaborate performance, then there was nothing left to save. I finished my whiskey and went upstairs to our bedroom, stripping off my clothes and sliding between sheets that still smelled like Rebecca's perfume. Tomorrow I would show her the photographs. Tomorrow I would confront her with the evidence of her betrayal, and force her to choose between the lies she'd been living and the truth she'd been avoiding. Tomorrow our marriage would either begin the long process of healing, or it would finally, mercifully, die. But tonight, for just a few more hours, I could pretend that the woman sleeping beside me was still the woman I'd married. I could pretend that the promises we'd made to each other still meant something. I could pretend that love was enough to overcome betrayal, that forgiveness was possible, that people could change. Rebecca came home at 2:15 a.m., slipping into bed with the practiced quiet of someone who'd done this many times before. She curled up against my back, her arm draping over my chest in a gesture that felt both familiar and foreign. Her skin was warm,
her breathing soft and even, and for a moment I almost forgot about David Thornton and the photographs and the systematic destruction of everything we'd built together. "I love you," she whispered against my shoulder, her voice thick with sleep, or guilt or both. "I know," I whispered back, because in that moment, lying in the darkness with my wife in my arms, I realized that love had never been the problem. The problem was that love wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to overcome lies. It wasn't enough to rebuild trust. It wasn't enough to save a marriage when one person had decided to destroy it. But it was enough to make what came next hurt like hell. The morning sun filtered through our bedroom windows with the kind of gentle light that made everything look peaceful and perfect. Rebecca was already awake, lying on her side and watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Her hair was tousled from sleep, her face free of makeup, and she looked exactly like the woman I'd fallen in love with a decade ago. "Good morning," she said softly, reaching out to trace a finger along my jawline. "You look tired, rough night." "Something like that," I replied, catching her hand and holding it against my cheek. Her wedding ring felt cold against my skin. "Rebecca, we need to talk." Something flickered behind her eyes, too quick to identify. "About what?" I sat up in bed, studying her face in the morning light. She was beautiful, there was no denying that. But beauty had never been enough to sustain a marriage, and it certainly wasn't enough to excuse betrayal. "About us," I said simply. "About where we are, where we're going. About whether we're still building something together, or just going through the motions." Rebecca sat up as well, pulling the sheet around herself like armor. "That's a pretty heavy conversation for 7 in the morning. When would be a better time?" I asked. "When you're working late again. When you're traveling for business. When you're in meetings that run until midnight." The barbs hit home, and I saw her flinch slightly. "I've been busy lately, I know, but you understand how important this startup is to me. How important it is to our future."
Our future. The phrase hung in the air between us like a question mark. Did we still have a future together? Could we still build something lasting after what she'd done? Did she even want to try? "I do understand," I said carefully. "I understand better than you might think." Rebecca's phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she reached for it automatically. The movement was so ingrained, so instinctive, that she probably didn't even realize she was doing it. But I noticed everything now. The screen lit up with a text message, and even though I couldn't read it from my angle, I saw Rebecca's face change. Her expression shifted from casual curiosity to confusion, to something that might have been panic. "Everything okay?" I asked innocently. She stared at the phone for a long moment, then looked up at me with wide eyes. Yes, everything's fine, just work stuff." But her voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there moments before. Whatever she'd just read, it had shaken her. I had a pretty good idea what it was. "Are you sure?" I pressed gently. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Rebecca set the phone down carefully, as if it might explode. "It's nothing, just unexpected news about the funding for my project." I nodded sympathetically, playing the part of the concerned husband, even as satisfaction bloomed in my chest. David had gotten my message. He was already beginning to pull away, and Rebecca was starting to feel the ground shift beneath her feet. "Bad news?" I asked. "I'm not sure yet," she admitted, her voice small and uncertain. "I might have to go in early today, to figure out what's happening." "Of course," I said, leaning over to kiss her forehead. "Do what you need to do. I'll be here when you get home." As Rebecca hurried through her morning routine, I watched her carefully. Every gesture seemed more frantic than usual, every glance at her phone more anxious. She was trying to maintain her normal facade, but cracks were beginning to show. The carefully constructed lies that had sustained her double life were starting to crumble, and she didn't understand why. She left for work 40 minutes earlier than usual, kissing me goodbye with lips that trembled slightly against mine. "I love you," she said, and for the first time in months, it sounded like a plea rather than a routine endearment. "I love you too," I replied, because it was still true. That was the cruelest part of the whole situation. Despite everything she'd done, despite the lies and the betrayal, and the systematic destruction of our marriage, I still loved her. Maybe I always would, but love wasn't enough anymore. It wasn't enough to excuse her choices or rebuild the trust she'd shattered, or pretend that our marriage could survive without fundamental changes. After she left, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and Kane's manila envelopes, preparing for the conversation that would define the rest of our lives. Rebecca would come home tonight expecting to maintain her charade for another day. Instead, she would find a husband who knew the truth, and a marriage that could no longer hide behind comfortable lies. The photographs spread across the table told the story of her betrayal in excruciating detail, but they also told another story, the story of a woman who'd lost her way, who'd confused excitement with love and deception with success. The question was whether she could find her way back, whether she was even willing to try. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Kane's name appeared on the screen. "Mr. Chen, I wanted to give you an update. David Thornton just canceled all his meetings for the day. His assistant says he's dealing with a family emergency." I smiled grimly. Family emergency, that's one way to put it. "There's something else," Kane continued. "We've been monitoring his communications, and he just sent a message to your wife, asking her to meet him for lunch. Emergency meeting, he called it." The pieces were falling into place exactly as I'd hoped. David was panicking, trying to control the situation before it spiraled completely out of his grasp. He would tell Rebecca some version of the truth, probably painting himself as the victim of circumstances beyond his control. He would try to end their relationship in a way that preserved his own reputation while leaving her confused and heartbroken. "Keep monitoring," I told Kane. "I want to know exactly what they discuss." After hanging up, I realized that Rebecca's world was about to collapse not once, but twice. First, David would abandon her, leaving her to wonder what she'd done wrong. Then I would confront her with the evidence of her betrayal, forcing her to face the consequences of her choices. It should have felt like justice. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it just felt like the necessary demolition of something that had once been beautiful. But sometimes, demolition is the only way to clear the ground for something new. Sometimes, you have to tear down the old structure completely before you can begin to build again. The question was whether Rebecca and I would be building together or separately. Rebecca came home at 6:30 that evening, her usual composed demeanor cracked like a broken mirror. She moved through our front door with the uncertain steps of someone whose world had shifted without warning. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from what I suspected had been tears shed in her car before facing me. "How was your day?" I asked from the kitchen, where I'd been preparing dinner with deliberate normalcy. The manila envelopes sat hidden in my office, waiting for the right moment. "Complicated," she said, dropping her purse by the door with more force than necessary. "David called an emergency meeting today. There are some changes happening with the funding." I continued stirring the pasta sauce, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "What kind of changes?" She walked into the kitchen and leaned against the counter, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "He's pulling out, says the firm is restructuring their investment priorities, focusing on different markets. The timing couldn't be worse." "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it, not because David had abandoned her, but because she was about to learn that her professional disappointment was the least of her problems. That must have been devastating news. "It was strange," Rebecca continued, accepting the glass of wine I offered her. "He seemed different, nervous, almost scared, like he was delivering someone else's message instead of his own decision. Perceptive as always, Rebecca had built her career on reading people, understanding motivations and hidden agendas. Of course she would notice that David's behavior didn't match his words. "Maybe he's dealing with pressure from his partners," I suggested. "These venture capital firms can be cutthroat." "Maybe." She took a long sip of wine, studying my face over the rim of the glass. "Michael, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Have you noticed anything different about me lately? Anything that might suggest I'm not happy with our marriage?" The question hung in the air between us like a loaded gun. This was it. The moment when I could either continue the charade, or finally force us both to face the truth. I turned off the burner and faced her fully. "Why do you ask?" "David said something today. He suggested that maybe I should focus on strengthening my personal relationships, instead of pursuing new business ventures. Said I might have been neglecting the important things in my life." Her voice carried a note of confusion, as if she couldn't understand why he would suddenly care about her marriage. I set down my wooden spoon, and looked directly into her eyes. Rebecca, what would you say if I told you that I know about your affair? Or what would you say if I told you that I know about your affair? The wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the kitchen tiles in an explosion of glass and Merlot. The sound seemed to echo through the house, marking the end of 8 years of marriage built on trust, and the beginning of whatever came next. What did you say? She whispered, her face going white. I know about David Thornton. I know about the hotels, the fake conferences, the romantic dinners disguised as business meetings. I know about all of it. Rebecca stared at me for a long moment, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Finally she found her voice. How long have you known? Long enough to hire a private investigator, long enough to gather evidence, long enough to have a very interesting conversation with David this morning. Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed quickly by something that looked like panic. You talked to David? What did you tell him? I showed him photographs, I said calmly, professional quality images of the two of you together, hotel receipts, restaurant bills, a complete timeline of your relationship. Then I explained to him exactly what would happen to his career if he didn't end things with you immediately. Rebecca's legs seemed to give out. She slumped against the counter, her breathing shallow and rapid. Michael, I can explain. Can you? I interrupted. Can you explain why you've been lying to me for months? Can you explain why you've been building a relationship with another man while pretending to love me? Can you explain why you thought you could have both lives without consequences? Tears began streaming down her face, but I felt no satisfaction in seeing them. This wasn't victory, it was necessary surgery on a relationship that had been dying slowly for months. I never meant for it to happen, she said, her voice breaking. It started as business, and then you chose to let it become something else. I finished. You chose to meet him at hotels, you chose to lie about where you were going. You chose to build an entire secret life, while letting me believe we were still building something together. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing mascara across her cheek. I was going to end it. I swear, Michael, I was going to tell David that we couldn't continue. When? I asked. Before or after you moved in with him? Because that's what he was offering, Rebecca, a new life, new funding for your company, a fresh start without the complication of your current marriage. Her face crumpled. He told you about that? He told me a lot of things, about how you'd discussed leaving me, about how he'd been planning to set you up in a new apartment, about how I was just a husband problem to be managed. The phrase hit her like a physical blow. She actually recoiled, pressing herself back against the counter as if trying to disappear. He never called you that, she said desperately. I would never, maybe not in those exact words, but that's what I was, wasn't it? An inconvenience standing between you and the life you really wanted. Rebecca shook her head violently. No, that's not true. I love you, Michael. I've always loved you. You have a strange way of showing it, I replied. Love doesn't sneak around, love doesn't lie, love doesn't build relationships with other people while pretending commitment to someone else. I walked to my office and retrieved the manila envelopes, returning to the kitchen where Rebecca still stood surrounded by broken glass and spilled wine. I placed the evidence on the kitchen table and opened the first folder. Look at them, I said quietly. Look at what love looks like when you think no one is watching. Rebecca approached the table like she was walking to her own execution. The first photograph showed her and David entering the Fairmont Olympic Hotel, her face radiant with anticipation. She stared at it for a long moment, then reached for the next one with trembling fingers. Image after image told the story of her betrayal. Rebecca laughing at something David whispered in her ear, David's hand possessively placed on the small of her back, the two of them sharing an intimate dinner in Portland while I sat at home, believing she was networking with potential clients. I look happy, she said finally, her voice barely audible. You were happy, I confirmed, happier than you'd been with me in years. That's what hurts the most, Rebecca. Not that you had an affair, but that you found something with him that you couldn't find with me anymore. She looked up at me with eyes full of pain and confusion. Then why did you stop it? If you knew I was happy, why didn't you just let me go? The question was so simple, so devastatingly honest, that it took my breath away. For a moment I couldn't answer. Why had I fought so hard to save a marriage that was clearly making both of us miserable? Because you didn't give me the choice, I said finally. You decided unilaterally that our marriage was over, but you kept me around as a backup plan. You wanted the security of being married to me while exploring other options. That's not love, Rebecca, that's selfishness. She nodded slowly, as if finally understanding something that had been eluding her for months. You're right, I was selfish. I wanted everything, and I thought I could have it without anyone getting hurt. Well, someone did get hurt, I said. Several someones actually. Me obviously. But also David, whose career is now hanging by a thread, and most importantly, you. Because now you have to live with the knowledge that you destroyed something good for something that was never real. Rebecca wiped her eyes again, trying to compose herself. What happens now? Do you want a divorce? I'd been dreading this question, partly because I wasn't sure of the answer myself. A month ago, divorce would have seemed unthinkable. A week ago it would have seemed inevitable. But sitting here with my wife, watching her confront the wreckage of her choices, I realized that the future was still unwritten. I don't know, I admitted. I know that I can't live with the lies anymore. I know that if we're going to have any chance of rebuilding this marriage, it has to be on completely different terms. No more secrets, no more separate lives, no more pretending that everything is fine when it's not. What would those terms look like? She asked quietly. Complete transparency, access to your phone, your email, your calendar. Couples counseling, both individual and together. A commitment to rebuilding trust that might take years to complete. And most importantly, a real conversation about whether we both actually want to save this marriage, or if we're just going through the motions because it's easier than starting over. Rebecca considered this for a long moment, her eyes moving between the photographs and my face. And if I can't agree to those terms, then we file for divorce, and we try to do it with as much dignity as we can manage. No fighting over assets, no character assassination, just two people who couldn't make it work, despite their best intentions. She laughed bitterly. Best intentions? I'm not sure I can claim those anymore. Everyone makes mistakes, Rebecca. The question is whether you're willing to do the work to fix them. We stood in silence for several minutes, the weight of 8 years hanging between us like a bridge that might collapse at any moment. Finally, Rebecca began gathering the photographs, stacking them neatly as if organizing them could somehow make their contents less devastating. I need to call David, she said. I need to apologize for putting him in this position. No, I said firmly, you don't contact David again, ever. That relationship is over, and any communication between you will only make things worse for everyone involved. She started to protest, then seemed to think better of it. You're right, it's just it feels wrong to end things without any closure. Some relationships don't get closure, I said. Some relationships end because they have to, not because anyone wants them to. David understands that now, so should you. Rebecca nodded reluctantly, setting the photographs aside. What do I tell people at work? About the funding, about why the project is ending. Tell them the truth, that your investor had a change in priorities, and decided to pull out. It happens all the time in business, no one will think twice about it. And what do I tell myself? She asked. How do I live with what I've done? I moved closer to her, close enough to see the tears threatening to spill over again. You start by being honest. With me, with yourself, with everyone who matters to you. You stop trying to manage everyone's perception of you, and start dealing with reality. And you decide whether you want to fight for this marriage, or whether you want to walk away with whatever dignity you have left. Rebecca reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against mine. I want to fight for it, I want to fight for us, but I don't know if you can ever trust me again. I don't know either, I admitted, but I'm willing to try if you are. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick, and there are no guarantees. But if you're serious about rebuilding what we had, then we start tomorrow with a counseling appointment, and complete honesty about everything that went wrong. She squeezed my hand, and for the first time in months, the gesture felt genuine. I'll call a therapist first thing in the morning. We'll call together, I corrected. No more handling things separately. If we're going to do this, we do it as a team. That night we slept in the same bed for the first time in weeks, but everything was different. There was no pretense of normalcy, no comfortable lies to cushion the harsh edges of reality. Rebecca lay on her side facing me, and I could feel her watching me in the darkness. Michael, she whispered. Yeah, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that I'm genuinely, completely sorry for what I've done to you, to us. I know, I said, and I'm sorry too. For letting our marriage drift so far apart that you felt like you had to look elsewhere for connection. That's not your fault, she protested. I made the choice to cheat. You didn't drive me to it. Maybe not directly, but marriages don't fail in a vacuum. We both stopped trying somewhere along the way, and we both need to take responsibility for that. We talked until dawn, not about practical matters or logistics, but about feelings and fears and hopes for a future that suddenly seemed possible again. It wasn't the conversation that would save our marriage, but it was the first honest conversation we'd had in months, and it felt like a foundation we could build on. 3 months later, we were still building. Counseling twice a week, individual therapy for both of us, and slowly, carefully, the reconstruction of trust that had been shattered by months of lies. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks and arguments and moments when divorce seemed inevitable. But there were also breakthrough conversations and small victories and the gradual return of intimacy that felt genuine rather than obligatory. David Thornton had disappeared from Seattle's venture capital scene as quietly as he'd entered it. Word around town was that he'd moved to Los Angeles to start fresh, leaving behind a trail of burned bridges and ruined relationships. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, just a quiet relief that he was no longer part of our story. Rebecca's startup had folded without David's funding, but she'd found new opportunities that didn't require compromising her integrity. She was working for an established marketing firm now, building her reputation on talent rather than personal relationships. The pay was lower, but the work was honest, and she came home each night without carrying the weight of secrets. Our marriage counselor, Dr. Sarah Martinez, had warned us that rebuilding trust would be a years-long process, and she was right. But we were both committed to the work, both willing to be vulnerable and honest in ways we'd avoided for too long. We were learning to communicate without accusations, to disagree without attacking, to love without possessing. On our 9th wedding anniversary, Rebecca gave me a gift that meant more than any expensive watch or vacation could have. It was a letter, handwritten on simple paper, detailing everything she'd learned about herself and our relationship over the past year. She didn't make excuses for her affair, didn't try to minimize the damage she'd caused. Instead, she took full responsibility for her choices and outlined specific commitments she was making to ensure nothing like it would ever happen again. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it in my wallet. It wasn't a guarantee that our marriage would last forever, but it was proof that we were both serious about making it work. That evening, as we sat on our deck overlooking Lake Washington, Rebecca asked me a question that had been hanging between us for months. Do you think you'll ever be able to fully trust me again? I considered the question carefully, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. I think trust is like this lake, I said finally. It can be polluted, damaged, made toxic by careless actions. But with enough time and effort, with the right commitment to healing, it can become clean again. Maybe not exactly the same as it was before, but clean nonetheless. Rebecca nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. I want to help clean it, however long it takes. It takes as long as it takes, I replied, reaching for her hand. But we're in this together now. No more secrets, no more lies, no more separate lives. Whatever happens, we face it together. As the stars began to appear over the water, I realized that our marriage had been reborn in the ashes of betrayal. It wasn't the same relationship we'd started with 8 years ago, but it was stronger in some ways, more honest, more intentional. We'd learned that love alone wasn't enough to sustain a marriage, but love combined with commitment, honesty, and hard work could overcome almost anything. The private investigator photos were still in my office, locked in a file cabinet like evidence from a crime that had been solved. I kept them not as weapons to wield against Rebecca, but as reminders of how far we'd fallen, and how far we'd climbed back. They were proof that people could change, that marriages could be rebuilt, that even the deepest betrayals could be forgiven, if both people were willing to do the work. David Thornton had thought he was stealing my wife, but in the end he'd given her back to me. Not the woman she'd been when he first seduced her, but the woman she became when she finally chose to fight for her marriage instead of running from it. It wasn't the ending I'd expected when I first discovered her affair, but it was the ending we'd both earned through months of painful honesty and careful reconstruction. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well, building something beautiful from the wreckage, and proving that love can survive even when trust has been shattered. Our marriage wasn't perfect, might never be perfect, but it was real in a way it hadn't been for years,
and that was enough. 5 years passed before I truly understood the cost of redemption. Our marriage had survived, even thrived in ways that surprised both Rebecca and me, but the scars ran deeper than either of us had initially realized. It wasn't until our couples therapist, Dr. Martinez, suggested we attend a retreat for couples recovering from infidelity, that I began to see the broader picture of what we'd been through. The retreat was held at a rustic lodge in the Cascade Mountains, far enough from Seattle to feel like a different world entirely. 20 couples gathered in a circle on the first evening, each carrying their own version of betrayal and recovery. As we went around sharing our stories, I was struck by how similar yet unique each experience was. The details changed, but the fundamental patterns remained constant: broken trust, shattered assumptions, and the long difficult journey back to something resembling normal. Rebecca squeezed my hand as we listened to a woman named Patricia describe discovering her husband's affair through a credit card statement. The pain in her voice was fresh despite the fact that the betrayal had happened 3 years earlier. Time didn't heal all wounds, I realized. It just taught you how to live with them. When our turn came, Rebecca spoke first. She'd grown more comfortable over the years with taking responsibility for her choices, with owning the damage she'd caused without wallowing in self-pity or making excuses. But hearing her tell our story to strangers still sent a chill through me. I had an affair with a business partner for 4 months, she said simply. I lied to my husband repeatedly, built an entire secret life, and nearly destroyed our marriage for someone who turned out to be using me. Michael discovered the truth through a private investigator, confronted both of us, and somehow found the strength to offer me a chance at redemption that I definitely didn't deserve. The group listened without judgment, nodding with the understanding that only comes from shared experience. When Rebecca finished, the facilitator, a therapist named Dr. Patricia Reeves, turned to me. Michael, what would you add to that? I considered the question carefully. I'd add that revenge is easier than forgiveness, but forgiveness is more sustainable. When I first discovered the affair, I wanted to destroy everyone involved. Instead, I chose to destroy the circumstances that allowed the affair to happen. There's a difference, and it matters. Dr. Reeves nodded. Can you explain what you mean by that? I could have ruined David's life completely, cost him everything. Instead, I just removed him from the equation. I could have humiliated Rebecca publicly, made sure everyone knew what she'd done. Instead, I focused on creating conditions where she'd have to choose between her lies and our marriage. The goal wasn't punishment, it was clarity. An older man named Robert, whose wife had cheated with a neighbor, leaned forward. But weren't you angry? Didn't you want them to suffer the way you were suffering? Absolutely, I admitted.
There were moments when I fantasized about complete destruction, but anger is like fire. It can burn down everything in its path, including the things you actually want to save. I had to learn to channel it constructively. Rebecca spoke up. He's being modest. What he did required incredible self-control. When someone betrays you that deeply, the natural response is to lash out to make them feel the pain you're feeling. Michael found a way to hold me accountable without destroying me. That's what made redemption possible. The retreat continued for 3 days with workshops on communication, trust-building exercises, and group discussions about the long-term effects of infidelity on relationships. One exercise particularly struck me. We were asked to write letters to ourselves from 5 years in the future, describing what we hoped our marriages would look like. I found myself writing about a relationship built on radical honesty, where both partners felt safe to express their needs and concerns without fear of judgment or retaliation. A marriage where love was demonstrated through actions rather than just words, where commitment was renewed daily rather than taken for granted. Rebecca's letter focused on becoming the kind of partner who could be trusted completely, someone whose words and actions aligned consistently. She wrote about wanting to model integrity for the children we hoped to have someday, to show them what it looked like when someone made serious mistakes but did the work to make amends. On the final day of the retreat, Dr. Reeves facilitated a session called The Ripple Effect, where we examined how our experiences with infidelity had impacted not just our marriages but our entire lives. The exercise revealed layers of consequence I hadn't previously considered. Michael, Dr. Reeves said, you mentioned that you used a private investigator to gather evidence. How did that process change you as a person? The question caught me off guard. I'd always focused on how the investigation had changed our marriage, but I'd never really examined how it had changed me. It made me more careful, I said slowly. More aware of the signs when something isn't right, but also more empathetic to people going through similar situations. I understand now how easy it is for marriages to drift apart, how quickly trust can erode when people stop paying attention to each other. Has that awareness helped you in other areas of your life? I thought about it. Yes, actually. I'm a better friend now, more attentive to the people I care about. I'm more direct in my communication at work, less willing to let problems fester, and I've become someone other people come to when their relationships are in trouble. It was true. Over the past few years I'd become an unofficial counselor for friends and colleagues dealing with marital problems. James Rodriguez had called me when he suspected his wife was having an emotional affair with a coworker. My neighbor Tom had asked for advice when he discovered his wife's gambling addiction. In each case, I'd been able to offer practical guidance based on what Rebecca and I had learned about crisis management and recovery. Rebecca had experienced her own ripple effects. The end of her startup and the loss of David's funding had initially felt like professional suicide, but it had ultimately led her to a career that was more authentic and sustainable. She'd discovered that she was actually happier working for someone else than trying to build her own empire, and her reputation for ethical business practices had made her valuable to clients who prioritized integrity over flash. More importantly, she'd become involved in support groups for people who'd committed infidelity, helping them understand the impact of their choices and find paths toward redemption. It was painful work, forcing her to relive her own mistakes repeatedly, but she said it helped her maintain perspective on how much damage infidelity could cause. I never want to forget how it felt to be the person who broke someone's trust, she told the group. The moment I start making excuses or minimizing what I did is the moment I become capable of doing it again. The retreat ended with a ceremony where each couple renewed their commitment to each other, not with traditional wedding vows but with promises specific to their journey of recovery. Rebecca and I stood before the group and made new promises based on everything we'd learned. I promised to choose transparency over comfort, Rebecca said, her voice steady and clear, to share my struggles and temptations rather than handling them alone, to earn your trust through consistent actions rather than demanding it based on time past. I promised to choose curiosity over assumption, I replied, to ask questions when something feels wrong rather than building resentment in silence, to see you as a complex human being capable of growth rather than defining you by your worst moments. The ceremony was simple but profound, marking not the beginning of our marriage but the maturation of it. We were no longer the naive couple who'd thought love was enough to sustain a relationship. We were partners who understood that marriage required constant attention, regular maintenance, and the willingness to do difficult work when things went wrong. Driving home from the retreat, Rebecca and I talked about the couples we'd met and the stories we'd heard. Some were further along in their recovery than us, others were still in the early stages of rebuilding. A few seemed to be going through the motions of reconciliation without really addressing the underlying issues that had led to the infidelity in the first place. What do you think makes the difference? Rebecca asked as we wound through the mountain roads, between the couples who make it and the ones who don't. I considered the question. Willingness to change, I think, not just the person who cheated but both partners. The marriages that survive are the ones where both people recognize that the old relationship is dead and they need to build something completely new. Do you ever miss it? She asked quietly. The way we used to be before everything happened. It was a question she'd asked before and my answer had evolved over time. I miss the innocence, I said. The feeling that we were bulletproof, that nothing could really threaten us. But I don't miss the complacency. We were coasting, taking each other for granted. The crisis forced us to become intentional about our relationship in a way we'd never been before. Rebecca nodded. I miss feeling like a good person, like someone who would never be capable of that kind of betrayal. But I don't miss living unconsciously, making choices without considering their consequences. We drove in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. The landscape outside was changing from mountain forest to suburban sprawl, marking our return to the real world where our rebuilt marriage would be tested by the ordinary stresses of daily life. When we arrived home, I found myself looking at our house with new eyes. It was the same building where our marriage had nearly ended, the same rooms where lies had been told and truths had been revealed. But it felt different now, like a space that had been consecrated by suffering and redemption. That night, as we prepared for bed, Rebecca pulled out a journal she'd been keeping since the affair. She'd never let me read it, and I'd never asked to, but tonight she handed it to me without explanation. "I want you to understand something," she said, "about what it was really like for me during those months." The journal entries were painful to read, not because they detailed her relationship with David, but because they revealed the depth of her confusion and self-deception. Entry after entry showed a woman convincing herself that what she was doing wasn't really cheating, that she deserved happiness even if it came at someone else's expense, that she could somehow have both lives without anyone getting hurt. But the most revealing entries came after our confrontation, when she was forced to face the reality of what she'd done. The shame was overwhelming, the guilt almost paralyzing. She'd written about wanting to disappear, to start over somewhere else where no one knew about her mistakes. She'd written about the fear that I would never forgive her, that she'd destroyed the only real love she'd ever known for something that had turned out to be an illusion. "Why are you showing me this now?" I asked when I finished reading. "Because I want you to understand that the person who had that affair isn't who I am anymore," she said. "I had to kill that version of myself to become someone worthy of your forgiveness, and I need you to know that it wasn't easy. Redemption required me to destroy parts of myself that I'd thought were unchangeable." I set the journal aside and pulled her close. "I know, I can see the difference in you every day. You're not the same person you were 5 years ago, neither are you," she pointed out. "You're stronger now, more confident. The way you handled David, the way you've handled our recovery, it showed me a side of you I'd never seen before." She was right. The man who discovered his wife's affair had been passive, reactive, more comfortable avoiding conflict than addressing it directly. The man who'd confronted David Thornton was someone different, strategic, assertive, willing to fight for what mattered to him. The crisis had forced me to develop capabilities I'd never known I possessed. "Do you think we would have made it if I'd handled things differently?" I asked. "If I'd just confronted you immediately instead of gathering evidence first?" Rebecca considered this. "I don't think so. If you'd come to me with just suspicions, I would have denied everything and gotten better at hiding it. The evidence forced me to face reality, and the way you handled David showed me that you weren't just a victim to be pitied. You were a man capable of protecting what was his." We talked until the early hours of the morning, processing not just our own experience but everything we'd learned from the other couples at the retreat. Each story had illuminated different aspects of infidelity and recovery, showing us that our journey, while unique in its details, was part of a larger human pattern of falling and rising, breaking and healing. As dawn broke over Lake Washington, painting our bedroom in shades of gold and pink, I realized that our marriage had become something neither of us could have imagined when we first said our vows. It wasn't the fairy tale romance we'd started with, but it was something more valuable, a partnership forged in fire, tested by the worst either of us could do to the other, and strengthened by the choice to keep fighting for something worth saving. The private investigator photos still sat in my office file cabinet, but they'd transformed from evidence of betrayal into reminders of how far we'd traveled together. They documented not just Rebecca's affair, but the moment when our real marriage began, the moment when we both chose truth over comfort, accountability over excuses, and love over pride. David Thornton had been right about one thing: Rebecca had deserved to be happy. What he'd failed to understand was that happiness built on deception was ultimately hollow, while happiness built on truth and hard work was sustainable. We'd chosen the harder path, but it had led us to something real and lasting. Standing at our bedroom window, watching the sun rise over the water, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete confidence in our future together. Not because we were perfect, but because we'd proven we could survive imperfection. Not because we'd never face challenges again, but because we'd learned how to face them together. Our marriage had died and been reborn, scarred but stronger, wiser but still capable of joy. It wasn't the ending either of us had expected when I first discovered those incriminating photographs, but it was the ending we'd both earned through years of difficult, honest work. Sometimes the best stories aren't about perfect people making perfect choices. Sometimes the best stories are about flawed people choosing to become better, about love that survives even when trust has been shattered, about marriages that emerge from crisis stronger than they were before. Our story had become one of those, and I wouldn't trade it for all the fairy tale romances in the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.